It seems appropriate that we shoot this program from the John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida, NASA's activity here.
The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll. Vehicle rolling from tail south, round 235.
This is where man has gone into space from, come back to. Our farthest out technology has been used around here. But we're going to talk about even farther out technology, about visitors from the stars and how we can get to the stars as well.
Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
Also here in Washington is Stanton Friedman, a physicist who's been involved in nuclear space and research for such companies as General Electric, Westinghouse, and General Motors. He has studied and lectured on UFOs for almost 30 years and is in Washington this week taking part in the International Symposium of the Mutual UFO Network. Mr. Friedman, there are books, there are magazine articles, there are television interview programs which have very little time, such as this one. Give it your best shot. If you are seeking to convince the skeptical, what do you point to?
I'm seeking to convince the healthy agnostics. The skeptics don't want to listen to the data and my findings. I point to the 2,400 plus landing trace cases, physical changes in the environment, collected from 65 countries. I point to the 3,200 cases in Project Blue Book Special Report 14, 20% of which couldn't be explained, and all the characteristics we attribute to flying saucers. I point to the 3,500 pilot sightings collected by a NASA scientist on the West Coast. I point to Bud Hopkins' 140 abductees with a waiting list of 200, and an enormous amount of data in the form of documents, some of them obtained from the government directly, some not so directly, clearly indicating that our planet is being visited, that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, and that we are indeed dealing with a cosmic Watergate. There is no way in the world I can tell you everything you always wanted to know about flying saucers in one program or even 5. There's an enormous amount of information out there. There's a lot of nonsense out there too. Part of our job today is to separate the two. I can't give you all the data. What I can do is sort of take you by the hand and lead you past the evidence that has led me to the conclusions that I've reached after 35 years of study. 4 major conclusions. 1, the evidence is simply overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline the some about 18 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. 2, the subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate. That is to say, some few people in the governments of the United States, Canada, undoubtedly many other countries, it is a worldwide problem after all, have known since July 1947, when 2 crashed flying saucers and their crews were recovered in New Mexico, that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. 3, none of the arguments made by a very small group, very noisy debunkers, skeptics, noisy negativists, whatever you want to call them, against the first two conclusions, stand up under careful consideration. Their arguments sound great until you look at the evidence. Then they collapse of their own weight. And finally, 4, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, the wreckage, the bodies, etc., by the government for more than 46 years. Strong words. By the time we're finished, I think you'll see how I got to them, and perhaps you'll agree with them as well. With today's modern technology, it's not too difficult to fake any kind of photographs. You know what computers can do. You see it on television all the time. But that isn't so true for pictures of flying saucers taken 20, 30, 40 years ago, even 10 years ago. There are a lot of pictures. I'm sure there are a lot more sitting in people's drawers at home in their cabinets waiting for the breakthrough to come when the government tells all. But we can look at a selection of these. There have been motion pictures. We're getting to the point where there are a lot of video cameras because lots of camcorders are around. His first one was taken motion picture in the southwestern part of the United States near the Four Corners area. You see the very rapid pace across the middle of the picture. That's a natural monument in the background, not a man-made structure. You notice the second one coming after it. That lasts for a total of about 20 frames, roughly 1 second, not much to work on. So let's slow it down and look at these two going across. Now, movie cameras are not ideal scientific instruments because the exposure time is pretty long, 30th of a second or so, compared to what you'd want for a scientific experiment. But it's an interesting piece of photography. There are a lot of decent stills around which have been analyzed by professional scientists. Here's one of 2 from McMinnville, Oregon, taken by a farmer, Paul Trent, not a sophisticated individual at all. Pictures have been analyzed by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist with a Navy research lab, a very sophisticated individual. He's looked at the original negatives, examined them very carefully. You can see there's 2 pictures, and then we'll blow up the object, enlarge it in the second one. Notice the interesting shape and the sort of hood ornament there up at the middle. This next picture was taken near Rouen, France by a French military pilot 4 years, 6,000 miles away. Same shape, same hood ornament, obviously rented from the same great car rental agency in the sky. This next picture is one of 3 that were taken near Santa Ana, California by Rex Heflin, who worked for the state highway department. He was driving his van. He had a Polaroid camera on the seat of the car, always did, in the seat of the van. Saw this object, took pictures from inside the van, first out ahead of him. You can see that here. We can enlarge that first one, sort of a hat with the dome on it. Then 2 pictures taken outside to the right, taken from inside the van, but through the side door window. This is Santa Ana, California. 3 years later, and 7,000 miles away, includes Romania. We have another set of 3 pictures. There were 3 witnesses to this one, 2 people watching the guy take the pictures. They were analyzed in Romania, again in England, published in one of the better journals, the Flying Saucer Review. Here's yet another object from Bolodic, Yugoslavia that looks like the same model. Nobody's saying they all look alike, just as obviously our spacecraft don't all look alike. Here's another set of pictures, this time from Salt Lake City, Utah. There's a sequence of 7. I've seen the negatives uncut, taken by a professional photographer. There's no building there. There's nothing reflecting off glass. You can follow the object as it moves from left to right across the sky. And yes, that's the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City. And then we'll enlarge number 5, 1 through 7 there, you see. Enlarge number 5. And I think that region around the object is an ionized air plasma related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system. The next picture is from Hawaii. The object's in the upper right-hand portion. You notice the palm trees and the hula girls. And here's a blow-up of that same frame. That's Hawaii. Here's one from Yungay, Peru. 2 objects in this one in the upper left-hand portion of the picture. And here's a sequence from Trindade, Trindade, I'm told it's pronounced, 600 miles east of the coast of Brazil. The ship was there as part of the International Geophysical Year and had an official Brazilian Navy photographer on board. There'd been a sighting earlier in the week in that area. It was broad daylight. Suddenly everybody shouts, "Hey, there goes a flying saucer. Take a picture," in Portuguese, of course. Grabs his camera, takes the pictures, takes 6 of them. 4 of them show the object. As the object came in from the right at high speed, makes a sharp turn and takes off again, a Saturn-shaped object like the planet Saturn. The pictures were eventually released to the public by the president of Brazil, Juscelino Kubitschek. Here's the first one. This is at some distance now. Here's number 2. Here's number 3. And here's number 4. And this is the best of the batch, so we'll blow that one up and we'll enlarge it once again. And we're kind of back where we started. At least 50 different companies on this planet that could build things that look like that. But I know of none that back in the 50s could build things that look like that and fly like that. High speed, sharp turn, no noise, no visible external engines, no wings, no tail. If it wasn't built here on Earth, it was built someplace else. And it's time we did something about it. What I'm trying to do is to make you aware of the overwhelming evidence that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. To remind you of something you already know, that is to say, we all do have something in common on this planet. We're all Earthlings. And also to demonstrate that we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate.
We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
My first reaction was, Polaroid? It's got to be real. I mean, how do you fake a Polaroid? And that's what had me convinced to go ahead and put it in the paper right away.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
Well, you'll hear that over and over again, everywhere I go. How come most people don't believe in UFOs? You must be the only scientist that believes in UFOs. Let's look at the facts. Here are the results of 4 Gallup polls that have been taken, asking the same question. Do you think UFOs are real, imaginary, or you're not sure? Even back in the mid-60s, before we'd been to the moon, the believers outnumbered non-believers 1.5 to 1. In the late 70s, it was better than 2 to 1 believers over non-believers. Now, admittedly, sometimes the data's been sort of misrepresented because they leave out the not sure types. I remember a newspaper headline that said only 46% believe in UFOs, implying that 54% did not. The fact was only 29% did not. The rest couldn't make up their mind one way or another. Anyway, you'll notice in the most recent of the polls, and there was another one within the last couple of years, shows the same results. The believers still outnumber the non-believers by 1.5 to 1. Now, every politician would like odds like that at the election. Now, a skeptic might say at this point, hey, I know why that is. That's because all those supermarket tabloids have convinced people that there's something to flying saucers. Right? Wrong. That's a testable hypothesis. If it were true that it was the influence of the crazy stories in the tabloids, then presumably the greater the education, the less likely to believe in flying saucers, because I think it's fair to expect that people with more education are going to be less influenced by the tabloids. Well, if you look at the bottom of this information, the bottom part of this story, you'll see quite the reverse. Now, admittedly, for adults, and this is all adults now, it's not children, adults with only a grade school education, the non-believers slightly outnumber the believers. Getting a high school diploma makes believers over non-believers 2 to 1. And with a college background, it's almost 3 to 1. Simple conclusion: the better the education, the greater the education of the individual, the more likely to believe in flying saucers.
I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?
Ronald Reagan made allusions to alien forces not once, but 5 different times, including a speech before the United Nations.
And why did he say that 5 times? Once, it's a nice figure of speech, but he said it in the United Nations. He said it to Gorbachev in Geneva. Gorbachev responded, saying he didn't disagree with him. He said it at a high school in Maryland. Why bring that up unless there was some reason for bringing it up? The greater the education, the more likely to believe. That's exactly the opposite of what the skeptics have been trying to tell us for decades, but they don't have any data. If you're a believer, you're with the cream of the crop. It's time to come out of the closet. You're not at the bottom of the barrel. Let's stop being apologist ufologist and closet ufologist. Let's tell it like it is.
While in space as command pilot on Gemini 5, astronaut General James McDivitt saw an unidentified object approach his spacecraft and then move away when he tried to film it. One astronaut who actually chased a UFO while a fighter pilot in Germany in 1951 is Colonel Gordon Cooper. One of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, Colonel Cooper sent this letter to the United Nations November 9th, 1978, to express his view on UFOs. I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets, which obviously are a little more technically advanced than we are here on Earth.
Incidentally, a poll taken of engineers and scientists involved in research and development activities, twice no less, shows that 2/3 of those who expressed an opinion said they're real too. So you're in very good company.
As a presidential candidate, Jimmy Carter vowed to completely open the government's UFO files because Carter said he had seen one himself. In 1977, there were hints in national magazines that disturbing revelations were about to be made by the president. They never were. And Carter didn't open the files. We wrote to ask him why, and we're told Carter is too busy for any interviews.
In the early days, the arguments were all along the lines, first of all, what people claim to have observed is obviously impossible, so they couldn't have observed it. Now, let's understand, that's backwards science. The observations are real, whether you understand them or not is beside the point. I mean, the sun has been fusioning, that's how it produces its energy, for 5 billion years. We figured out how it worked in 1937. Does anybody want to suggest because we didn't know how it worked that it wasn't working? That's nonsense. That's not science. Now, the list of its impossibles has shrunk as we've accomplished those objectives over the last 4 decades or so, many by work that's you can see here. But there are 2 arguments that are still being made, technological arguments. The first of the it's impossible arguments is that you can't get here from there. It's usually made in a much fancier way, and typically by astronomers for reasons which I don't understand. The argument goes like this. It's a huge universe out there, billions of light years, billions of galaxies, billions of stars. Surely there's life all over the place out there. And some of that life must be more advanced than we are because they've been around a lot longer than we are. Life all over the place, but you can't get here from there. So give us a few bucks, we'll build a radio telescope and listen for signals because undoubtedly the more advanced civilizations are trying to attract our attention with radio signals. You know, hello Earth, just waiting for us to join the galactic radio network. Did you ever hear such silly nonsense in your life? Especially when you add into the picture, as one professor suggested, when we hook into the network, they will then transmit to us all the secrets of the universe. Why would an advanced civilization give its secrets to a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare? That's us, in case you didn't recognize the description. Would make as much sense to give 2-year-olds loaded guns to play with. Now, you can't get here from there. Right? Wrong. Now, we can go to the scientific record. There have been loads of papers published, and what a track record it is for the astronomy community. Back in 1903, a great American astronomer, Simon Newcomb, October 1903, published a paper in which he showed that the only way man would ever fly would be with the help of a lighter-than-air vehicle, a balloon. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. When he heard about the flight, his comment was, well, maybe a pilot, but they'll certainly never carry any passengers. We know how right he was. Another great astronomer in the 20s said that, proved, mathematical equations, that it would be impossible ever to give anything sufficient energy to get it into orbit around the Earth. You don't have to look far around here to know how wrong that was.
Yeah, we're getting some really spectacular video downlink from the payload bay cameras. You guys are just passed over Hudson Bay, we believe, and I guess we're seeing a lot of cloud patterns over Hudson Bay. Just before that, we're seeing large bodies of water.
My favorite, though, is a Canadian astronomer, Dr. Campbell. In 1941, he was sick and tired of all this science fiction stuff about going to the moon. So he did a scientific paper in which he tried to calculate the required initial launch weight of a rocket. Just a chemical rocket, which is what all these are, able to get a man to the moon and back. That's a legitimate question. How big would it have to be? Pages of equations. Bottom line, the required initial launch weight of a chemical rocket able to get a man to the moon and back would be 1 million tons. Now, even for me, that's too big. But isn't it interesting that less than 30 years later, we got 3 guys to the moon and back, still with the chemical rocket, whose initial launch weight, one of the members of the Saturn family, like this one back here, the initial launch weight wasn't 1 million tons, it was 3,000 tons. He was off by a factor of 300 million. How could he be so far off? Because he made all the wrong assumptions. How could such a respected academic professor be so far off in his calculations? He wasn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last. His problem was that he made all the wrong assumptions because he didn't know anything about space travel. That's what aeronautical engineers are for. For example, he assumed a single-stage rocket. None of our manned space launches have been done with single-stage rockets. 2, 3 stages, more like it. Saves a lot on weight. He assumed a limit of 1 g acceleration for the rocket. Now, certainly we can all stand 1 g, but the astronauts who get on these babies sometimes are subjected to 5, 6, or 7 g's. The escape tower on the old Apollo spacecraft and the Mercury and so forth, if the astronauts had to come off the rocket real quick because there was a problem down below, they would have to take 13 g's. Without damage either, it was expected. That makes an enormous difference. He assumed you launch straight up. Well, as anybody comes here knows, you bend over pretty quick, you launch to the east, you do a lot of cosmic freeloading. Another example of freeloading, something we do on all our deep space shots, incidentally, it's not a bad word, is he assumed, quite correctly, that when you came back to Earth from the moon, you would, of course, have to slow down. I mean, that goes without saying. You're going 25,000 miles an hour. That's not a good landing speed. But he assumed the only way you could do that would be to turn the rocket around and fire the retro rocket to slow you down. But, of course, every pound of propellant you use at the end had to be launched from the Earth at the beginning, slowed down at the moon, launched from the moon, most of it slowed down back here. And it takes at least 10 pounds of propellant per pound of payload to move it through each of these steps. What do? We get smart instead of powerful. We say the atmosphere is already here. Let's use it. We convert the problem from brute force into hitting the atmosphere at just the proper angle. If you come in too steep, you dig a big hole in the ground. Not a good way to make a landing. If you come in too shallow, you go right on by the Earth. That's not a good way to get home either. But if you do things properly, you come down, and it doesn't take any propellant at the end of the trip. So he was far off, no question about that. But can you get here from there or not? There are loads of papers by aeronautics experts, astronautics experts, engineers, showing that trips to nearby stars, our local neighborhood again, within less than 50 light years, are feasible with round-trip times shorter than the average person's lifespan, and without violating or even amending any of our most sacred laws of physics, and using staged fission or fusion propulsion systems, two different nuclear techniques, on both of which I have worked. I said staged again, you notice. Now, some people might think, uh-oh, here comes the science fiction. Got to have science fiction and flying saucers, right? Wrong. There really were nuclear rocket programs. I've worked on both fission and fusion. The NRX-A6 nuclear rocket reactor propulsion system, reactor's only about this big, had a power level of 1,100 megawatts, half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. I worked for Westinghouse on that one. That was preceded, incidentally, just to surprise you a little more, aircraft nuclear propulsion systems in the late 50s. We successfully operated jet engines on nuclear power. Nuclear ramjets in the mid-60s successfully operated nuclear power on the ground. Now, the fission program was the largest, and we had a whole bunch of different systems that we tested. Here's the Phoebus 2B. Los Alamos built these, a whole series of them. Very similar to the NRX-A6, a little larger, maybe this big. The most powerful one had a power level of 4,400 megawatts. That's twice the power of the old Grand Coulee Dam, this big. Now, this isn't Walt Disney now in a science fiction movie. This is reality. That ran, and these pictures were taken from a long distance away. You don't want to be close to one of these things when they're operating. That's nuclear fission. Yes, it's the same energy conversion process that's used in nuclear-powered submarines, aircraft carriers, cruisers. There's over 300 nuclear-powered ships out there. They won't take you into space. But really, I'm much more excited about nuclear fusion. That may seem like a strange word to you to realize nuclear fusion is the most important source of energy in all our lives. The sun up there is not a mass of burning gas, no oilmen up there. The sun is a fusion factory. That's the process that produces the energy. Now, it's true that indeed H-bombs involve fusion as well. That's controlled fusion, but for a very short period of time. Anyway, back in the early 60s, I worked on nuclear fusion propulsion systems. Government-sponsored contract. We didn't test hardware like the fission rockets. But give the program, $60 billion in 20 years, you'd have man-rated, very exciting deep space fusion propulsion systems. What's the big deal about fusion? Well, there are two big deals. One is if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket, only in space now, that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in one of these chemical rockets. On a miles per gallon basis, surely fusion is the way to go. In addition, the stuff you use to kick out the back end, isotopes of hydrogen and helium, which just happen to be the two lightest and most abundant substances in the universe. Wherever you go, the gas stations may be closed, but you're going to find hydrogen and helium. So we Earthlings already know how to get to the stars. It's a political choice. Do we want to spend the money? I'm not saying we should. But we don't need new laws of physics, just one heck of a lot of good engineering, such as went into this, and courage.
This home videotape was recorded during one of the trips to the Groom Mountains.
Okay. Good luck.
No way, did you see that move it did?
No, I didn't.
It went like this, it went boom, boom. Wow, look how bright it's getting.
Look at it now.
Getting bright.
Not bright enough for me to get the son of a bitch.
Here, hold on, right here. Are you there?
No.
It is bright right now.
So progress comes from doing things differently. That also applies when you move over to the other big objection to space travel, deep space travel, and coming here and then making right-angle turns. You'd be crushed to death against the walls, some noisy negativists say. They can't possibly make right-angle turns like that. There's a book, Physics for People Who Don't Think They'd Like Physics, and I don't like the book, which says when you get to 9 Gs, you die. Nonsense. NASA here has learned an awful lot about what kind of accelerations people can stand. They've done tests on centrifuges, rev them up. There's talk about courage, physical courage. Now 1 G is the acceleration of gravity here at the surface of the Earth. That's a change in speed of 21 miles per hour per second. So at 1 G, in other words, say you're in a very hot car, in 10 seconds at 1 G, you could get to 210 miles an hour. That's a pretty hot car. Okay, how much can people stand? Well, it depends on a lot of things. One of the things is the direction of the force on the body. You'll notice that when any of the astronauts go up, they're always on their back. Not like in an elevator. They're not standing up and the rocket goes up this way, but the force is back to front. Why is that? That's because they can stand a lot more acceleration back to front than foot to head. Well, how much can they stand? A trained pilot, this is measured data now, a trained pilot can handle 14 Gs for 2 minutes and perform a tracking task while being accelerated. Now, what does that mean? 14 Gs is an acceleration of just about 300 miles per hour per second. So if you were starting from rest and being kicked at 14 Gs, and it would certainly feel like it, at the end of 1 second, you're going 300 miles an hour. At the end of 10 seconds, you're going 3,000 miles an hour. And at the end of those 2 minutes, you're going 36,000 miles an hour, and you're long since out of sight and off the Earth. That's measured data, not theoretical, hypothetical, I wish we could, but we can't, so we won't kind of data. Now, in actuality, we can stand higher G loadings than that. The shorter the duration, the more the G loadings you can stand. For example, this is test data. You can stand 30 Gs for 1 second. What does that mean? That's 0 to 600 miles an hour in 1 second.
It came up above the same mountain. It moved around. It did a step move. It actually went up in the air like this and hovered, then dropped way down. Then it just floated around and cruised around, and then it started coming up the mountain range.
Now, when people report flying saucers, the time during which you go around the corner is very, very short. As a matter of fact, it appears that you could stand any acceleration as long as the duration is sufficiently short. I call it the hot potato syndrome. You're baking potatoes in the oven, it's time to take them off, out of the oven, put them on the table. You grab the potato, do you get burned or not? It depends on how long you hold on to the potato. Obviously, if you stay below some very short time, you're not going to get burned. When you go past that time, you're going to be hurt.
Through the telescope, we had seen it was an elliptically shaped light. You know, that's about, because you can only get so close, even with a telescope, to a secure facility. Anyway, it came by up by us very rapidly. It glowed and glowed brighter like a sun, and we almost got the feeling it was going to explode. It glowed so bright, and we backed up behind the car. Then it went down. It glowed back up a little bit, and very softly glided back where the mountains where it came up, hovered for a while, and then just sat down, just like you see in the movies.
Now, obvious question, of course. So how do you get such a high acceleration? Now, when we physicists accelerate particles in these big accelerators to very high speeds, close to the speed of light, which is an important part of this story, We don't do it by hiring grad students and hitting the particles as they go by with a broomstick or something like that. We do it electromagnetically. You got charged particles, you can hit them with electric and magnetic forces and really get them moving. Now, we talk about hypermaneuverability. We all know very maneuverable systems, Volkswagens, old O.J. Simpsons, a lot of different systems that don't work by carrying along something you throw away, that work by interacting with their surroundings. In the mid-60s, a brilliant professor named Stuart Way, working at Westinghouse, built, with the help of some grad students at the University of California, Santa Barbara, an electromagnetic submarine. Cost him $2,000 for spare parts and stuff. And it worked. No moving parts. Electric and magnetic fields at right angles to each other exert a force at right angles to both. You push against the seawater, which is an electrically conducting fluid. By Newton's laws, it pushes back, and off you go, slipping silently through the seawater, no moving parts. Now, that was a proof of principle device. It worked. Now, you may think, wait a minute. What's any of this got to do with flitting around in the atmosphere? Well, if you replace the electrically conducting fluid, seawater, with ionized air, that's the stuff that glows when a meteor comes in. That's the stuff that surrounds one of the capsules when the manned capsules come back to Earth and they're rushing through the atmosphere at very high speed, slowing down, heating the air. It becomes an electrically conducting fluid, and we have that blackout period. Remember that when the men came down? If you have an ionized air plasma around a vehicle, this is based on measured data, you can control heating, drag, lift, radar profile, little stealth activity there, and sonic boom production. All of these relate to the layer of air around the vehicle. So this is not an incredible technology. Interesting, different, not easy to play with in your basement, but the wave of the future is a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system.
In a moment, we'll examine the extraordinary and controversial story of a strange craft that crashed in New Mexico in 1947. This Air Force base here in Roswell, New Mexico, was the center of a controversy back in 1947 that over 40 years later still remains unsolved. Remnants of a mysterious craft were found on a remote ranch and allegedly stored here in Hangar 84. To this day, there are many who believe it was a UFO. When we first heard of the incident at Roswell, we assumed it was just another UFO sighting. It could be easily explained. A distant aircraft, an errant missile, or perhaps it was just a hoax. However, eyewitness accounts and disturbing evidence suggest that something strange happened here at Roswell.
This is the front page of the Chicago Daily News for July 8th, 1947. This is an evening paper. And almost all evening papers for that day from Chicago West carried this incredible story about Army finds air saucer on ranch in New Mexico. Disc goes to high officers. This is the front page of the Roswell Daily Record, an evening newspaper for July 8th, 1947. That's Roswell, New Mexico, town in the southeastern quadrant of New Mexico. Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. This is the front page of the Sacramento, California Bee, an evening paper, July 8th, 1947. Not quite so flamboyant. This is the front page with very flamboyant headlines of the Los Angeles Herald Express, an evening paper, July 8th, 1947. Now you'll notice it has the original story, the same as the others. But now it's got a second story. General believes it is radar weather gadget. Now, you notice that California is 2 hours behind Chicago, New Mexico 1 hour. What's going on here? We need a context here. The first UFO sighting to get national attention occurred in the Pacific Northwest on June 24th, 1947, just 2 weeks earlier than these headlines. Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot, in broad daylight was searching for a downed aircraft in the mountains of Washington State, and he spotted 9 objects that moved, as he later described it, as a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. He reported it when he landed. The press picked up on it. He didn't say they looked like flying saucers, but the press coined the term flying saucer. UFO wasn't used until after 1950. Within the next 2 weeks, there were sightings in 40-some states and several other countries. And it was headline material.
Army fighter planes are on patrol for flying saucers. Cameras installed to photograph them. Portland, Oregon, the area from which came the first weird reports. This flying saucer patrol shows how the Air Forces, while not putting too much stock in the mysterious things in the sky, are investigating. The control tower is in touch
happened
and on the watch.
Apparently about July the 2nd or 3rd, a rancher named Mac Brazel, on a ranch out in the boondocks, 75 miles or so northwest of Roswell, 15 miles southeast of the little town of Corona, heard a tremendous explosion late one night. It was during the middle of an electrical storm. He didn't think it was thunder, though. The next morning, he's out checking on a water pump. This is a sheep ranch out in the boonies. It's pretty dry, and water's very important. And he comes across an area 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred feet wide, strewn with pieces of strange wreckage. It was weird. There were pieces of a foil-like material, about the thickness of a foil on a pack of cigarettes. But you couldn't tear it, couldn't break through it. Later on, with a 16-pound sledgehammer, you couldn't break through it. Extraordinarily strong and extraordinarily light. There were some I-beam-shaped pieces, nothing bigger than about this long, about a half-inch high, about the weight of balsa wood, next to nothing. But you couldn't cut them, break them, burn them, and there were strange pastel symbols along the inside.
According to my dad, there was a bad thunderstorm the night before. The next day, he was out on the ranch, and he found this debris. And he picked it all up in his pickup and was talking to people, and of course, there was some talk about UFOs. He was going to Roswell. And as far as I know, he got in touch with the sheriff's department. They, in turn, called the Air Force.
Brazel, a rancher, the ranch had no electricity. He hadn't heard all these stories about flying saucers. There was a neighbor's young son visiting there because he liked to ride horseback with Mac. When Mac took him back to his home, the Porter family, he asked the neighbors to come out and see this stuff. He took some pieces with him. They handled it. They remember it. A Proctor family, Loretta Proctor.
The piece he brought up looked like kind of a tan, light brown plastic is what it looked like. Because we know plastic now. Back then we didn't have any plastic with it.
Finally, on July 6th, a Sunday, Mac decides to put some of the pieces of this junk in the back of his pickup truck and go into Roswell. He goes to the Sheriff Wilcox's office, tells the sheriff he's got this stuff. The sheriff looks at it, calls the base, the local Roswell Army airfield.
I asked him, do you think this is true? And he said, I don't know why Brazel would have come all the way in here and brought that stuff if it hadn't been something important, and that it had to be something that he thought was that.
It was a very special base. It was the home of the 509th Composite Bomb Group. That's the group that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and out in the Pacific in 1946. Hand-picked officers, hand-picked men, high security, a very elite special group. Flying B-29s, the Cold War was already heating up at that time. The sheriff, by prearrangement, called the base, talks to the base intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel. There was a pre-existing arrangement to do that. Jesse checks with his boss, and Colonel Blanchard, base commander, head of the 509th, goes into town, looks at the stuff, realizes it is indeed very strange, gets instructions to go with the counterintelligence corps man. Remember, this is highly classified base, lots of highly classified activity in New Mexico. Take the counterintelligence corps man, Sheridan Cabot, with you, see what's going on out there.
The material that we saw, just like it whatever it caused it was just like whatever there, it was just vaporized.
Now, there was no way you could tell Jesse and Cabot how to get there. It was out in the boonies. They had to follow the rancher out there. Took their sleeping bags, stayed overnight, had a can of beans, as Jesse told me. The next morning, the rancher shows them this area. And Jesse's mystified.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. There were just fragments strewn all over the area, an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide.
If there's all this wreckage, there had to be some kind of an explosion. He can't find a crater, so it must have happened in midair. They load 2 vehicles, an Army carryall and a Buick, with as much of this stuff as they can fit in. And there was lots of it left behind. And they head back toward town. It's late now. Jesse stops at home, wakes his wife and 11-year-old son, brings in some of the pieces of stuff to the kitchen table. They try to fit the pieces together to get some idea of how big this thing must have been.
There was black plastic type debris like bakelite, which was shattered. It was very brittle material. And then there were fragments of what appeared to be I-beams.
And the son is important because he's now a medical doctor, Jesse Marcel Jr. He's a pilot, he's a flight surgeon, he served on military aircraft accident investigative teams, was himself shot down in Southeast Asia. He knows wreckage. He has never seen anything like it, including those strange symbols.
Well, the most unusual part of this whole thing was what was on the I-beam, on the inner surface of the I-beam. Because as you look at it head on, there appeared to be a type of writing.
Well, Jesse goes into the base the next morning, and Colonel Blanchard gives 2 orders. One is to Jesse, get one of the B-29 crews to take you and this stuff up to Wright Field in Ohio. It's now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. All the base names changed when the Air Force became a separate body in September of '47, after this took place. Make a stop at our headquarters. The 509th was part of the 8th Air Force, which was part of the Strategic Air Command, then headquartered in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. area. 8th Air Force headquarters was in Fort Worth, Texas, and that's right on the way to Ohio.
I was in that operations office, and Colonel Blanchard drove up and came in and asked, is the aircraft ready? And I and one other fellow there, who was now dead, said, yes, it's sitting right out front, ready to go.
The second order he gave was to the base public information officer, a man named Walter Hout, to put out a press release announcing that they'd recovered the wreckage of one of these flying discs that people had been seeing for 2 weeks.
Got the telephone call from Colonel Blanchard, and in essence, he told me that he had in his possession a flying saucer or parts thereof. Gave me a little bit of idea where it came from, and ranch northwest of Roswell.
Walter did that at about noon New Mexico time. He wrote the release on the commander's orders, took it to the 4 media outlets in town, 2 radio stations, 2 newspapers. One of them put it on the wire. It went out all over the world, and the phones didn't stop ringing in Roswell, at the sheriff's office, at the base, at the newspapers, at the radio stations. Calls from London, England, and all over the world. Meanwhile, Jesse's in a plane with some of the wreckage and a whole crew on the way to Fort Worth, Texas. Before they had even arrived there, then Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose, who was Chief of Staff to General Roger Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force, had already taken a call from Clements McMullen, the acting head of the Strategic Air Command in Washington, telling him in no uncertain terms, they knew each other, I want you to cover up that story, I don't care how you do it, I want you to send some of that wreckage up here with one of your Colonel Couriers. And I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? No, sir. Again, you follow orders. He took care of it by having the wreckage of a radar reflector from a weather balloon brought in. That's what it was. To his office, no less. Strange place to bring wreckage. The media guys are waiting because of the wire service story. And gentlemen, the general says, we made a terrible mistake. It's not a flying disc or flying saucer at all. It's just a radar reflector from a weather balloon. What are you going to do with the wreckage, General? Oh, throw it out. What else? Now, the cover story went out about 5 o'clock, July 8th, 1947, Texas time. That was too late for the Eastern papers and even the Chicago paper. But that's why the Los Angeles paper has the original story and the cover story. And the next morning's papers all said, Ramey empties Roswell saucer. And that's where the story lay until I got involved in 1978.
Inflating an immense balloon aboard the USS Norton Sound, the Navy prepares for further study of the elusive cosmic rays somewhere in the Pacific. That's the news. A secondary consideration clears up the mystery of the so-called flying saucers. For it is these monsters which rise 19 miles and attain diameters of 100 feet that have been mistaken for the apparitions called flying saucers. At great altitudes, they tell us, these elongated enormities flatten out like plates. Mystery ended.
Some people said, why did they come running to you with their story, Major Marcel? He didn't. I was at a television station, and the station manager, we were waiting for a third reporter to interview me. I was going to be speaking at Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And out of the blue, the station manager says, you know, the guy you got to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And I say, who's he? He says, oh, we're old ham radio operators, we're buddies, and he handled pieces of the wreckage of one of these things when he was in the service. Well, that got my attention. I said, well, do you know anything about it? He says, lives over in Houma, Louisiana, which wasn't too far, although I didn't know where it was at the time. I've since been there. I called Jesse the next day, got his story, didn't remember the date. It sounded pretty straight. Not long thereafter, I got another story. I was at Bemidji, Minnesota, about another story about a crash saucer. A couple asked me if I'd heard about a crash saucer in New Mexico. I said, well, I have heard stories. Tell me more. Well, their friend Barney Barnett, a Soil Conservation Service engineer, ultra respectable, living in the town of Socorro, New Mexico, told them quietly, very good friends, that a saucer, he'd found an almost intact saucer stuck in the ground in New Mexico with bodies alongside it. They didn't have the date either. We had a third story, a colleague of mine, about an English actor driving across the country when he was in New Mexico, heard the radio broadcast about this story. When he got to the East Coast, thought it'd be a big deal. Nothing. That gave us the date, early July 1947. A colleague, William Moore, went to the University of Minnesota libraries, dug out newspapers. There were the stories. The stories, many of them were inaccurate, but they had names, they had information. They gave us a check on Jesse Marcel. Everything he said was true. It gave us the name of Walter Howard. It gave us the name of Colonel Blanchard and a whole bunch of other names. We followed up on those stories. The Barney Barnett story, we found his niece, we found neighbors, we found his boss. That story took place west of Socorro, which is about 160 miles west of the Corona site. And that left us puzzled. If there are bodies over there, why weren't there bodies here? Were there two vehicles? Was there one vehicle that had broken apart? It was a mystery. By 1985, we talked to 90 people, and we still hadn't resolved were there two crashes, one crash that broke up, or whatever. But then, after Unsolved Mysteries did their show on crash saucers, I instigated it, helped out, found a number of the people. I also was able to find and talk to Glenn Dennis, a mortician in Roswell at the Ballard Funeral Home, which handled the base's business. And he told me a story he'd never told anybody else. Glenn told the story that he got several calls in early July from the base mortuary officer. What should they do? What would he advise? What was the smallest body bags that they had there?
Yeah, I think I informed you that we usually kept a 4-foot, but I could possibly get a 3/6.
What fluids could you use to treat a body that had been out in the sun for a long time and that wouldn't interfere with later analysis of body fluids?
What would your procedures do to changing the, like the chemical compounds, the tissues, the blood and all that? What would that do? Would that destroy any of it?
And Glenn says, well, was there a crash? Well, no, this is all hypothetical. And he said, well, you know, when bodies are in a crash, you can fit them in a 5-gallon jug. No, these bodies weren't in a crash, but they were out in the desert for several days. Well, later that day, Glenn drove the ambulance, which was also a hearse, of course, in those days, dropped an airman off at the base hospital, parked it around the back, went in to see a friend of his who was a nurse in the base hospital. It was hot, just going to get a Coke.
This nurse had only been there, she'd only been commissioned like around 3 months. And she had graduated from college and taken the state boards and gotten her license, and then she went into the service.
He sees 2 Army ambulances out there with strange sort of half canoe-like segments in them and MPs guarding. And they challenged him. He says, well, I'm Glenn Dennis, I'm the mortician. He belonged on the base. He had clearances and stuff to get on the base.
Anyway, as I started back to see her, before I got back to the lounge, there was some examining rooms on each side of the hall. And she came out of one of the examining rooms and coming across the hallway. And I noticed she had I don't know, it was a handkerchief with a piece of gauze wad over her mouth. And then she saw me and she said, what are you doing here and how did you get in here? She said, my gosh, get out of here as soon as possible. She said, you're going to get in a lot of trouble.
Which is a strange way to be greeted. And there's a military guy there who shrieks at him, get that SOB out of here. Who is he? Nobody likes being called an SOB, and he did use the words. And he's confused about what's going on here. And this guy's yelling some more, get him out of here. And then Glenn said the wrong thing. Has there been a crash? Don't you go telling any stories about a crash. This guy's lambasting him verbally. And Glenn says, you can't do anything to me. I'm a civilian. Now, there's a black sergeant there. There's a red-headed, nasty officer, but I didn't know it when Glenn first told the story. And the sergeant says, we use guys like you for dog food. Glenn gets mad and says, we use guys like you for coyote bait. Great dialogue, but there's a reason for telling you that. Anyway, he gets literally escorted out, MPs on each side, taking him out to his hearse, follow him back to the funeral home. He gets a call later from the officer, don't you ever say anything, and he still doesn't know what's going on.
He said, you did not see anything, there was no crash here. You don't go into town and making any rumors that you saw anything, that there was any crashes.
The next morning, he leaves word for the nurse, and she calls him back, and they meet at the officers' club, and she's very upset. She had been going to get some supplies, and in the room she goes into, there are a couple of doctors autopsying 3 strange bodies there, and the stench was terrible.
She said, the doctor said, hey, this isn't anything we've ever seen before in our life, and there's no textbook that's ever covered this, you know.
She saw the bodies, but she wanted to get out of there. They said, oh, you can't leave. Well, I've got chores to do. Oh, no, you've got to help us. And she's taking notes while they're dictating, and this terrible smell.
I said it was the most gruesome, most horrible sight that she had ever seen in her life. The smell was almost devastating. She said, I was never so horrified in my life. And she said, I don't know if I'll ever sleep again or anything else. She said, I've never seen anything so gruesome.
She drew for Glenn what the bodies looked like. The upper arm was longer than the lower arm. Big heads, small bodies, big eyes, practically no nose, mouth, ears. 4 fingers, no thumb, long, slender fingers. She drew that for him, and he had to promise her he'd never talk about it.
She drew me a diagram of the head. She drew me a diagram of the arms and the hands. And it was on the back of a prescription pad where, you know, the nurses always carried a prescription pad, you know, and all taking notes and everything for the doctors and all that. these were rather small, but she had drawn those the night before, and she gave them to me. She said, you know, that you can have these, but there again, I was sworn to secrecy again, that, you know, either destroy them after I got through with them or whatever.
Glenn's testimony then opened up the notion that there were two vehicles that crashed. After the Unsolved Mysteries program ran, there are many more witnesses came forward. This is what led aviation and science writer Don Berliner, who's also been interested in UFOs for more than 30 years, and I, to do our book, Crash at Corona, with the latest testimony. And, you know, one thing that should be stressed here, there was very strong intimidation about two witnesses not to talk about what they saw. As an example of that, the sheriff's granddaughter, many years later, was living with her grandmother. The sheriff was dead. And there was something on television about flying saucers, and the grandmother said, you know, I've never told you, but the reason your grandfather didn't rerun for sheriff is that when that saucer crashed, he saw quite a lot. And after things were quieted down, the military came to him and said, if you ever talk about what you saw, we will kill you and we will kill your family.
She was standing there with my grandfather. I said, did you hear them say that, Big Mom? That's what I called her. And she said, yes, I did, Barbara. And she said, that's exactly what they told her.
Now, let me go back to the little story about the dog food. I learned that the most classified base, probably in New Mexico, at least was Sandia Base up in Albuquerque. Nuclear weapons related base. Even now it employs 8,500 people. It's a laboratory, 3,500 are engineers and scientists. That's probably where the wreckage from the Plains of St. Augustine stuff went, including the bodies. And many people have complained about this red-haired officer and black sergeant. Well, I only heard about that from Glenn Dennis the second time around. And then I got a call in a letter from somebody who'd watched the show who said he was out there at the site and he's describing what happened, and he too mentions a red-haired officer and a black sergeant. Completely independently, had no way of knowing of Glenn Dennis's testimony. Well, the interesting thing here, desegregation didn't happen until the following year. Blacks were not well treated in the military. And some people have said there weren't any black sergeants working for white officers. Well, there were. I've met one who worked at a SAC base who handled the dog detail, the canine detail. That's one place where this guy could have worked. And that would explain why he would make such a strange remark as we use guys like you for dog food. So this gives an internal consistency to the story. We would very much like to hear from anybody who knows anything about these stories. We won't use witness names without permission. Crash saucers are a very important part of the story of flying saucers. The evidence is overwhelming that responsible, respectable earthlings, people whose testimony you'd like on your side in a court of law, have indeed on many occasions observed not only saucers sitting on or near the ground, but saucers accompanied by critters, creatures, little guys, whatever you want to call them. I don't mean once or twice. There's a guy in Missouri named Ted Phillips who over the last couple of decades has collected more than 4,400 physical trace cases from 65 countries. These are cases where the saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, Landiger marks, swirled vegetation. I don't mean these crop circles, that's a whole other business. Directly associated with the presence of a real craft. And frankly, after you read your first 200 cases, it's dull. The same thing keeps happening all over the world. In 24% of those cases, over 1,000, reports are made of creatures associated with the craft. There's a humanoid study group of the Mutual UFO Network, the world's largest respectable UFO group. And they've collected more than 3,000 reports of humanoids. Abduction researchers, and I know a number of professionals who cumulatively have examined well over 1,000 abduction cases. Some of them involving several people at the same time, some of them involving the same people abducted repeatedly over a period of many years. Now, here's a typical physical trace case. This is on the Johnson farm in Delphos, Kansas. Ronnie Johnson, age 16, finishing his chores for the evening, getting ready to go in for dinner, looks up, and here's this glowing mushroom-shaped object sitting a foot or two off the ground, brilliantly lit. Not light bulbs, but just glowing. So bright he could barely see. You know how you get blinded by bright lights? He's standing there, kind of petrified, and frankly, he was paralyzed. He couldn't move, neither could his dog, so it wasn't psychological. He's standing there, and this thing suddenly takes off. It just clears the shed, whose shadow you can see in the picture, and it moves off slowly in the sky. He dashes into the house, 250 feet. I've been on the farm. Tries to tell his parents about this flying saucer that he'd just seen. Naturally, they laughed. They didn't believe him. Naturally, he got angry. You don't have to believe him. You go out and see it for yourself. And they did go out, and they did see it. Then, with a little more effort, he convinced them to go back to the place on their farm where this saucer had been sitting on or near the ground. They get out there, and they see this glowing ring of soil. The bottom of the tree was glowing. A board was glowing. This is really weird. Mother reaches down, touches the glowing ring of soil, picks up her hand. Her fingers go numb. Can't take pulses at the rest of them where she works as a nurse for the next couple of weeks. They're kind of concerned about this. They take pictures. They call the sheriff's office. The sheriff comes out the next day, takes soil samples. They're worrying about radioactivity. The soil wasn't radioactive. A reporter for the local paper, the Delphos Republican, picks up on the story because it's on the sheriff's file. This article appears in the story, in the paper, and a month later, Ted Phillips, this guy in Missouri who collects all these physical trace cases, gets sent a copy of the article. He checks with the sheriff. Yeah, I know the Johnson family for years. They're fine people. Ted decides to go out there. It'd been a month. There'd been rain. There'd been snow that had melted, but might be worth looking at. He gets out there. Everything is mud except for the dry ring of soil. Mud on the inside, mud on the outside, but the ring is dry. Pours water on the ring, runs right off. Doesn't get absorbed at all. Took a whole bunch of samples, both in the ring soil, the ring's roughly 10 feet in diameter, and in the inside and outside the ring, in the control samples. He ran tests. First, he ran a seed germination test. The ring soil wouldn't grow anything. The normal soil, the seeds germinated fine. He ran a moisture absorption test. You can see that here. That's water sitting on the dirt. It's not plastic. It's not glue. It's water. The stuff won't absorb moisture. Ted sent me samples of the soil, which you can see here, and I had good agricultural tests done by a professional testing laboratory. They found that the ring soil on the left had a higher level of soluble minerals. These are the things that affect plant growth than the normal soil on the right. They're obviously different in color and texture. That doesn't mean the aliens dumped their garbage here. It probably means that normal soil like that on the right was intensely irradiated with something like microwaves, like cooking a turkey in a microwave oven. It'll penetrate through 14 inches of soil. That's how far down it was dry in this ring. Convert some of the insolubles to solubles. It's a whole new direction for ufological research. A NASA manager has said that they would test any lab specimens that were required for testing about UFOs. He still hasn't agreed to test any soil samples. We're working on it. We're here at the Astronaut Hall of Fame, and behind me you can see a mock-up of the shuttle. That's the leading edge of today's manned spaceflight technology. It's unclassified. But many people seem not to be aware of how much technology has been developed under security. I spent 14 years of my life working on classified advanced research and development programs. They touch every aspect of advanced technology. And not only are there classified programs whose existence is known but whose details are classified, but there are also what are known as black programs, black budget items. These are items that are funded somehow without congressional oversight. How big are these programs? A Pulitzer Prize-winning author named Tim Weiner has written an exciting, extremely well-documented book, Blank Check, the Pentagon's Black Budget. He makes a convincing case that the annual black budget, not under congressional control, has been running about $35 billion. About half for technology, stealth fighters, stealth aircraft, and Lord knows what else, and about half for intelligence. And certainly the intelligence community is involved with flying saucers. That's been true from the beginning. Let me give you some demonstrations of that. A group of us called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, back in the late 70s, went after the CIA, everybody's favorite target, of course. We want all your UFO information. They said, we don't have any UFO information. You do too. We do not. We appeal. They deny. We go to court. There's a procedure under Freedom of Information. The judge asked that they do a search. They did a very limited search. They suddenly found 900 pages of material. Not terribly exciting, none of it above secret. I've been to 15 different government archives. Loads of top secret stuff has been declassified. Lots hasn't as well. Anyway, more important than the 900 pages of information was a list of 57 documents which they found dealing with UFOs, but that came from other agencies, and so they couldn't release them. Everybody and his brother was collecting data about flying saucers. The CIA, of course, was, but the OSI, the DIA, the ONI, FBI, Department of State. Most interesting were 18 documents from the National Security Agency. Now, they only give dates. We don't know what's in the documents. So we file a Freedom of Information request with the National Security Agency. And I have to understand, they're the big boys on the block. They spend about $10 billion a year of that black budget. It's a good name for it. And they employ, according to the Washington Post, 160,000 people. And yet half the people in my lecture audiences have never heard of the NSA. No such agency is the inside joke. Anyway, we've dutifully filed a Freedom of Information request with the NSA. We want these 18 documents as listed by the CIA. We get a page-and-a-half letter back saying we can't give anybody anything. Public law prevents us from releasing any information about sources and methods of intelligence. We say we don't want sources and methods, just the UFO data. We can't give you anything. We appeal. They deny. We go to court. The judge asked that they do a search. Now, we only knew about 18 NSA UFO documents. They come back to the judge. He says, how many documents did you find, gentlemen? 239, Your Honor, from 18 to 239. But 79 of those documents originate with other agencies. We can't release them. Interestingly enough, 23 of those documents were from the CIA, but hadn't been found by the CIA when they did their search. Okay, that's fine. That leaves 160 NSA UFO documents. We'll take those. We can't give you anything, you guys. They said, gentlemen, you don't seem to understand. We're talking national security here. We can't give you anything. We're going around in circles. So we tried a legal ploy that had been done before in other cases. We asked that they submit the documents to Judge Gerhard Giselle, the federal court judge, so that he could determine whether they are properly invoking national security. They absolutely refused to show him any of the documents. However, they provided him with a 21-page top secret plus affidavit justifying the withholding. He saw it in camera, that is in his chambers with a special clearance. Naturally, our lawyer didn't get to see that affidavit. The judge was so impressed with that he ruled in their favor they should not release their 156 UFO documents, that the public interest in disclosure, he said, was far outweighed by the potential danger to the security of the United States should this information be released. National security and flying saucers. We appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. They have oral and written hearings. The judges normally take 2 months to make their decision. They were shown the same 21-page top secret plus affidavit, and they agreed with the lower court. Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. We filed a Freedom of Information request for the 21-page top secret plus affidavit, and eventually we got it. And we expected some censorship in it, and there was. And as one turns the pages, one begins to see that almost all of it is blacked out. About 75 to 80% of that document has been blacked out. Now, the judge saw it clean. We didn't. And no, it's not illegal for them to do that. National security is one of the exemptions from freedom of information. Anybody who says no government agency is withholding UFO information simply isn't telling the truth. Now, there's a footnote to the story. I had naturally filed with the CIA for their 23 UFO documents as discovered by the NSA when they did their search. Now, they're supposed to respond in 10 working days. It took them 35 months to respond. I suppose that means they worked 10 minutes a day, I don't know. But when they did respond, they agreed to release 9 of those 23 documents. I was excited until I looked at them. They were press abstracts of Eastern European newspaper articles about flying saucers, which the Russians had the day they were published. Their own 14 documents they refused to release. They tried to discourage me from appealing. I appealed anyway. 2 years later, they responded to my appeal. They agreed to release tiny portions of 3 of the documents. Now, this is a released CIA UFO document. There are 8 words that you can read on the document. 8 words, and they're not exciting words. Title, doc reference, info location, info date, string of numbers. Now, admittedly, these guys have a kind of sense of humor, you might say. This document says, deny in toto. Couldn't even find 8 words on the page to release, as if this weren't denied in toto. Anybody who says government agencies aren't withholding UFO information isn't telling you the truth. There's no doubt in your mind, I gather, that the balloon story was a cover story.
Absolutely none. We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press.
Colonel Blanchard, in order to get out of their way, had backed into the doorway of the ops office, and I stepped up to him and I said, Colonel, turn sideways, I want to see too. Maybe if I hadn't said that to him, made it obvious that I was there, I would not have been shipped out 2 weeks later.
Some people might say, hey, look, so they're holding back data. What else is new? Everybody knows the government hasn't told us all it knows. If it can have a black budget of 34 billion, 35, 36 billion, does it matter? I think it matters a great deal. The best hope I see for a decent future for this planet is an earthling orientation, as opposed to the nationalistic ones, which we all pick up early on and keep the rest of our lives. The easiest way to get an earthling orientation is to recognize that to aliens coming here, we are all earthlings. The differences don't matter, I would expect, to them. So the reason I think this matters is, as a nuclear physicist very much concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, is that we need to move in the direction of the earthling orientation. It's time the government put some of the data out on the table. Now, some people might ask, well, why would the government hold back this information if they had it? Are they afraid of panic, a la Orson Welles in the radio broadcast back in the 30s? Let me give you 5 quick reasons for government cover-ups. 1, you want to figure out how the darn things work. You've got records. You set up your secret project. Rule number 1 for security is you can't tell your friends without telling your neighbors. They watch television, they listen to the radio, read the newspapers. Second problem, what if the other guy figures out how they work before you do? How do you defend against them? You don't want them to know. You know, they know. The third problem is the big one, the political problem. If there were to be an announcement tomorrow by highly trusted individuals saying indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft, what would happen? I think church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, stock market would go down, but I think the biggest thing that would happen is an immediate push on the part of the younger generation, never alive when there wasn't a space program, for a whole new view of ourselves, indeed as Earthlings, instead of Americans, Chinese, Russian, Cuban, whatever. And there's the rub. I know of no government on this planet that wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. Nationalism is the only game in town. Just look around. Fourth reason, certain religious groups have said this is all the work of the devil. There are no other living beings out there anywhere. A fifth reason is economic discombobulation. If an announcement were to be made that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft, no matter how carefully, a lot of people would think that soon there'd be new methods of ground transport, air transport, communications, agriculture, energy production, you name it. What does that do to the stock market? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? It's a tough transition. Just look at Eastern Europe right now. They've got freedom, they've had elections, they don't have bread, they do have inflation. We don't know how to make that transition very well. Okay, now, what are my goals about all this stuff? Very simple. I've got a 16-year-old daughter. I'd like to see her generation act in such a fashion that we could qualify for admission to the cosmic kindergarten. If we can't do that, maybe the cosmic preschool. I think it's the best hope for a decent future for the planet. I have a 6-year-old grandson. I hope his generation behaves in such a fashion that we create a planet that is indeed suitable for intelligent life. I don't think we've done a very good job so far. If you have information for me, you know anything about crash saucers, government cover-up, and you don't want your name used, that's okay. Please contact me. Welcome to Volume 2 of Flying Saucers Are Real. We'll present information on the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction case, The star map work that tells us where those particular alien visitors originated, supposed autopsy of an alien being recovered in New Mexico, the Operation Majestic 12, MJ-12, magic papers, which I think are the most important documents ever leaked to the American public. Join us. There is no way in the world I can tell you everything you always wanted to know about flying saucers in one program or even 5. What I can do is sort of take you by the hand and lead you past the evidence that has led me to the conclusions that I've reached after 35 years of study. The evidence is simply overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. Some UFOs are alien spacecraft.
It came from this direction over here, which is toward the Holiday Inn, and just came straight up and then moved directly over us, and then out over across the bay and took a right-hand turn and went at a northeast direction and then blinked out.
The subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate. That is to say, some few people in the governments of the United States, Canada, undoubtedly many other countries have known since July 1947, when 2 crashed flying saucers and their crews were recovered in New Mexico, that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft.
Area 51, that mysterious corner of the Nevada test site, is no longer much of a secret. The fact that secretive things go on here is a given, even to the Soviets, who make daily spy flights over the facility to take a peek at what's going on. It's the perfect place for secret things, but of course, that's no secret. 51 is ringed by the forbidden vastness of the Nevada test site, by the looming Groom Mountains, and by sparsely populated desert expanses. The few people who do live out here have no love lost for the military, but they're conservative, patriotic, and they mind their own business. You ever see stuff you can't explain?
Sure. Lots of stuff.
Care to elaborate?
No.
UFOs. Is there a government conspiracy to keep the truth from America? Tonight on the UFO Conspiracy, a team of investigators uncovers provocative new evidence.
We're dealing with a cosmic Watergate.
Thursday, October 11th, 1973, around dusk. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing at this site on the Pascagoula River when they say a strange craft emitting a bluish light came down and hovered just above the ground 30 feet away. Now living and working in Golden Meadow, Louisiana with his family, Calvin believes the U.S. government has knowledge of extraterrestrial life that it is hiding from the public.
I think the government more or less knows about them, but they're just scared to get it out in the public.
Do you think the United States government is keeping something from us about UFOs?
There's no doubt in my mind that they are.
Man is not alone in the universe. He's not alone in the neighborhood. Our future as Earthlings is tied in with space. The time to start thinking in those terms is now. There are three different categories of UFO sighting reports. First, the IFOs, that is, UFO sightings converted into identifiable flying objects. People have seen all kinds of things, and most sightings can be explained. Having said that, let's forget Category 1 sightings. Category 2 sightings must also be dismissed. These are the reports for which there is insufficient information on which to base any kind of scientific judgment as to what was observed. If you don't have enough data, forget it. There's no point in wasting your time on those sightings. Finally, that leaves us only with the sightings in Category 3. These are the reports by competent observers of strange phenomena in the sky or on the ground, which the observer cannot identify, which remain unidentified after investigation by competent investigators, and which furthermore we judge to be manufactured objects based on the way they look, not just lights in the sky, and we deduce they were made someplace else based on the way they were observed to behave.
This home videotape was recorded during one of the trips to the Groom Mountains.
Okay, good luck.
No way, did you see that move it did?
No, I didn't.
It went like this, it went boom, boom. Wow, look how bright it's getting.
Look at it now.
Getting bright.
Not bright enough for me to get the son of a bitch. Here, hold on, right here. Are you there? No.
It is bright right now.
A major point I'd like to make in this program is that every large-scale scientific study of flying saucers has provided us with a substantial number of Category 3 reports. Competent observer, competent investigator, plenty of data, and every indication we're dealing with intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft.
This is one of 3 videotapes of a bright light in the skies over Gulf Breeze. This is another. People have flocked to the south end of the Bay Bridge in the past few weeks in droves over recent reports.
What brought you out here in the first place?
Curiosity. I'm a skeptic and I don't believe in flying saucers. I had to come to see for myself.
Well, what do you think now after what you saw?
Well, I'm still not convinced it's a flying saucer, but it's not a plane and it's not a helicopter. So whatever it is, I still haven't made up my mind.
Now, the largest study ever done, official, comprehensive, government-sponsored study of flying saucers, was completed, believe it or not, way back in 1955. The study was done by the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, a very well-respected research and development firm. Now, it was Battelle's job to go through 3,200 sightings from the Blue Book files for the period 1947 through 1952, and a very few thereafter. Every sighting report was eventually categorized as something or other: aircraft, balloon, astronomical, miscellaneous, the insufficient information category, and of course the unknowns. Every sighting was evaluated as to quality, subjective evaluation, but a useful one. They put all this data together in a big fat report, Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. Now, unfortunately, the report itself has never been publicly distributed by the Air Force. Instead, what was given wide distribution was a 3-part package: a press release, from which I'll quote in a minute, a supposed summary of this study, and I say supposed because unfortunately it has none of the data from the 240-some charts, tables, graphs, and maps. I don't know how you could call it a summary, but they did. And an official Air Force drawing of sort of a comic book flying saucer. And the thrust of this package was, look, we just finished this huge study of flying saucers. There's nothing to them, but soon we will be building things that look like saucers, and if you see one, don't worry about it, it's ours. That's what the public was told.
The United States Air Force, in discharging its responsibility for the aerospace defense of the nation, is called upon to investigate reports of unidentified flying objects. 2 Air Force officers have over the years been very closely associated with this activity. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Tacker was formerly the chief spokesman for the Air Force on the matter. And Major Hector Quintanilla is now the chief of Project Blue Book. Major Quintanilla, what are the objectives of Project Blue Book?
The objectives of the program are twofold. They're the same as they have been since 1953 when the regulation was written. First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomena presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomena exhibits any technological advances which could be channeled into research and development.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
This is a copy of the privately published version of Project Blue Book Special Report 14. It is kind of interesting that the press release didn't mention the title of the report, because surely some reporter would have said, what happened to 1 through 13? They were all classified at that time, and the Air Force certainly wasn't talking about them. Now, in the press release, the Secretary of the Air Force, mind you, Donald Quarles, said, quote, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects, such as those properly described as flying saucers, have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available, unquote. Well, let's look at the categorization of the 3,201 sightings. You'll notice that there are several different categories, psychological aberrations, that's a nice way of saying crackpot cases. But the ones we're interested in are the unknowns. And you'll notice that the percentage of unknowns wasn't 3%, it wasn't 6%, it wasn't 12%, it was 21.5%. 7 times greater than the public was told by the Secretary of the Air Force. I suppose if one were generous, one might say that he wasn't very good at arithmetic. Now, the skeptic at this point might say, hey, wait a minute now, you said earlier that they did a quality evaluation of all those sightings. How do we know that those unknowns aren't just those 2-second observations at 4 in the morning by the town drunks of the world? Perfectly legitimate question. Let's look at the quality evaluation of those same 3,201 sightings. The better the quality of the sighting, because of the background of the observer, the duration of observation, the circumstances, the more likely to be listed as an unknown. Exactly what you'd expect if the unknowns were really something different.
Say hello now to Derek from Norfolk. Hello, Derek.
Hello, Nick.
Hello. What do you believe in?
Well, I believe in the UFOs.
Do you?
I have seen a UFO, actually. I live in Norfolk. I used to be a security guard, so I used to wander around quite a bit at night time.
Yes.
And remember, at this point, we're dealing strictly with unknowns. Forget all the things that turned out to be Jupiter and Venus and searchlights on clouds and flocks of birds. I mean, the list is as long as my arm. First, what did they look like? Well, typically we're dealing with the unknowns, with apparently round, symmetric, seemingly metallic, disc-shaped objects, definite size, shape, surface texture, things sticking out that might be landing gear, might be antenna, might be decorations. We don't know. Those are interpretations. Typically, but not always, bigger in diameter than thickness, sometimes with a kind of dome, size ranging from, say, 10 feet in diameter up to perhaps 150 feet in diameter. That was the biggest category of unknowns, but there were also some very exciting reports of large cigar-shaped so-called motherships, into and out of which the little discs fly. Now, with just a physical description of these unknowns, the round ones, the huge mother-shaped objects, the huge cigar-shaped mother vehicles, we have no basis at all for saying these things come from off the Earth. Why not? Well, because there are at least 50 different companies down here on the surface of this planet that could build things that looked as I described. They built a lot of the stuff that's here at the Space Center. You know, Lockheed, NASA, Rockwell International, under contract to NASA, Boeing, and a bunch of other companies. It's only when we add into the picture the behavior of these unknowns that we're suddenly forced to concede that we're dealing with something of extraterrestrial origin. Because these round, metallic, disc-shaped objects were able to sit still in the sky, hover, move straight up, straight down, move forward and then back without turning around, move at extremely high speeds horizontally, say 8,000 miles an hour as observed on radar, make almost right-angle turns at high speeds like 2,200 miles an hour. All this rather unusual flight behavior typically without any visible external engine, without any wings, without any tail, without any noise.
Area 51, that mysterious corner of the Nevada test site, is no longer much of a secret. The fact that secretive things go on here is a given, even to the Soviets, who make daily spy flights over the facility to take a peek at what's going on. A man who once worked at Groom Lake as a technician wrote this letter explaining how he inadvertently walked into the wrong hangar and saw what appeared to be a large metallic disc under a tarp. And an airman who worked at Nellis at a radar installation says he and his fellow servicemen watched over a period of 5 nights unusual objects flying over the Groom Mountains. He says the radar images indicate the objects zoomed into range at speeds of 7,000 miles per hour and then would stop on a dime, and that nothing we have is capable of doing that. The airman says that when word of his sighting got out, he was ordered to turn off his radar sensors for that area and told to keep quiet about the matter because it did not happen.
And I submit to you that back in the early 50s, there was no company on the surface of this planet that could, in quantity, because people often reported seeing whole flocks of these things, that could in quantity build things that both looked as I described and acted as I described. Because if they could, we Earthlings would no longer be building F-16s, 17s, 18s, MiG-29s, Mirage 5. The single most important thing about a flying saucer, from any government's viewpoint, is the potential for utilization of the technology for military purposes.
Major Quintanilla, what are the objectives of Project Blue Book?
First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomena presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomena exhibits any technological advances which could be channeled into research and development.
Since we are still building F-16, 17, 18s, MiG-29s, Mirage 5, then what people saw back then wasn't built here on Earth. And if it wasn't built here, it was built someplace else.
Continuing to receive downlink television from the forward bulkhead camera of the cargo bay of the orbiter.
Now, where do I think they're from? Well, I'll name specific star systems a little bit later, but just down the street in our local neighborhood, that's a concept I try to get people to understand. Within 54 light years of here, in all directions around us, there are about 1,000 stars. Of those 1,000 stars, 46 are similar to the sun. Not too hot, not too cold, not too old, not too new, a lot of other similarities, and might be expected to have planets and life. That's our focus, our local neighborhood.
Well, joining me now are eminent scientist and believer in extraterrestrial intelligence, Stanton Friedman. Stanton, if I can start with you. You are a nuclear physicist. You have your feet very firmly on the ground as a scientist, yet you believe in UFOs. How does this come about?
It's very easy, since 2/3 of the people who express an opinion about flying saucers say they're real, and the greater the education, the more likely to believe they're real. It would be surprising if I didn't. It comes because I've spent 38 years collecting evidence, reviewing data. I've lectured at 600 colleges. I get lots of feedback. I've published 70 papers. That gives you more feedback. I do a lot of investigation.
It's unlikely that anyone who's ever seen these photos will forget them. Odd shapes in the sky, accounts of laser-like blue beams, descriptions of alien creatures, and close encounters over the road.
And even though I had the photos right there in front of me and he was telling me all this, it was still hard to accept because things like that just don't happen, A, in Gulf Breeze, and B, to us.
Burbank Tower, this is American Flight 812. Over. That's nothing from this world.
You suppose a passenger saw it?
I doubt it. Most of them are asleep. But it was quite a jolt, Jeff. I'll check.
Good. We'll get it ready for landing. Keep it quiet until we get instructions.
Right.
Okay, Danny.
We normally think of courage in spaceflight in terms of how brave anybody was to get in the top of this rocket with all that propellant sitting below you, or any of those others, crammed. Who knows what's going to happen? Our jet jockeys who take their chances in very sophisticated, unforgiving equipment. There's a different kind of courage that's required. That's the courage to fight for your ideas. What we find is that every step along the way, the guys with the new ideas were being hit on by the guys who say it can't be done. Not by guys who knew what they were talking about, but people who, for whatever reason, wanted to guard the status quo.
Vehicle rolling from tail south around 235-degree azimuth, northeast.
Something about your flight?
Yeah.
What happened, Jeff?
I saw a flying saucer.
Well, did you report it?
Yeah. I radioed in immediately, and they said, we'll keep it quiet until you land. And as soon as we landed, big army brass grabbed us and made us swear to secrecy about the whole thing.
If there's anybody out there that got started just a little bit before we did on his or her technological kick, what do they know that we don't know? And how much time head start could they have? There are stars out there that are 5 billion years older than the sun. That's billion. Surely we could give them 1 million years head start on us. We've only been around 1 million years or so, something like man. The solar system is 4.5, 5 billion years old. So surely somebody out there could have 1 million years head start. Within 54 light years of here, in all directions around us, there are about 1,000 stars. Of those 1,000 stars, 46 are similar to the sun. Not too hot, not too cold, not too old, not too new, a lot of other similarities, and might be expected to have planets and life. That's our focus, our local neighborhood.
Alleged abductions of humans by aliens have been around since the early 1960s. Betty and Barney Hill, a middle-aged New Hampshire couple, were reportedly snatched up by aliens in a flying saucer and eventually had their memories blocked. Since their case was made public, thousands of others alleged abductions have been reported all over the world.
This is Betty and Barney Hill. It's a very famous case, took place in 1961. There's a whole book, The Interrupted Journey, television movie, The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones. It was September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney were driving home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is on the coast between Portland, Maine, and Boston, from Montreal. Driving through the White Mountains late at night, nobody around. Betty spots a strange object. Barney was driving. She's looking out her side. A light in the sky, moving, following the contour of the mountains. And she watched it for a while. She wasn't going to say anything.
Suddenly, we began to see a strange light in the sky, which was maneuvering in a very erratic pattern. This light began flying along beside us and did this for about 30 miles until we came to an area known as Indian Head.
Took the binoculars, they're bird watchers, took the binoculars out of the glove compartment, looked over at it, and it was strange, and it was moving in a strange fashion. Finally, she worked up enough courage to tell Barney. It's late at night now, after midnight. Barney, there's a flying saucer out there. Oh, Betty, there are no flying saucers. It must be an airplane. He looks, probably a Piper Cub. Don't worry about it. You know what a Piper Cub's doing up there at 1 in the morning, I don't know, but she says, Barney, it can't be. Look at it. Look how it's moving. Look at the lights. Oh, well, maybe you're right, Betty. It must be a helicopter. A helicopter. There are no flying saucers. And they talk quietly as they're heading south in the valley. This is following the hills. And suddenly it moves out across the road.
And at that place, this light left the top of the mountain, came out over the highway, and stopped in midair directly in front of us.
Barney jams on the brakes, gets out of the car. He's bound and determined. He's going to prove to Betty there's nothing strange about that strange thing out there. In the first place, it's sitting still. It's just hovering. Less than 200 yards away, he estimates, 60 to 80 feet in diameter, just sitting there and no sound. Sitting there. No visible external engines, no wings, no tail, no blinking red and green lights. He cranks up the binoculars. There's a double row of windows there. He's moved out away from the vehicle now. Suddenly, he gets scared because on the other side of the windows looking back at him are some strange-looking beings.
He panicked and he ran back to the car saying they planned to capture us and we had to get out of there. And we went speeding down the highway.
He burns rubber. He's getting out of there.
And at that point, we heard beeping sounds and the car vibrated.
They see a sign that says Concord, New Hampshire, 17 miles. Should have been 50 miles. There's a lot of other strange little details that you have to read the book, The Interrupted Journey by John Fuller, to get.
Now, when we arrived home, we had many puzzles. The tops of Barney's shoes were scuffed. Our watches had stopped functioning. There were highly polished spots in the trunk of the car.
Anyway, they report to the police that next day, who say, call Pease Air Force Base, which is just outside Portsmouth. They report it there. They hear about NICAP, a group that investigates UFOs. So a month later, a NICAP investigator comes out and gets their whole story. But he has them go over the story systematically. What time did you leave Montreal? How fast were you driving? How much time for coffee and gas? And what time did you get home? When they do it this way, it becomes painfully obvious that they got home at least 2 hours later than they should have gotten home. It's only 192 miles.
But the biggest mystery of all was the fact that it had taken us 7 hours to drive 190 miles.
It was suggested then that they see a hypnotist to find out what happened during the missing time interval. Well, they were both busy people. Betty, a social worker, supervising the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney, working in the post office down in Boston, but on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission. Betty checks with a colleague. As a social worker, she knew lots of psychologists. You know, we seem to have this missing time. Don't worry about it. Your memory will come back. Just wait a while. So they waited and waited and waited and waited. And Betty had nightmares about strange beings kidnapping them. Barney developed an ulcer that got so bad he couldn't go to work. By now, 2 years have gone by, and they've got to do something. They got to get Barney back to work. Betty gets a referral, or Barney gets a referral from a psychologist to a psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, down in Boston. And the idea was to take care of two problems at once. Find out what happened during the missing time and get rid of the ulcer so he could get back to work. Okay, every Saturday morning they drive the 60 miles to Boston. Betty waits outside. Barney goes in. Dr. Simon hypnotizes him, has him relive, not retell, but relive with all the emotions a portion of the experience. He tapes it, induces amnesia at the end of the session, so Barney won't remember what he said, can't talk to Betty about it, calms him down. Some of these are pretty powerful sessions. Sends Barney out, brings Betty in, does the same thing with her.
He said, I know it, but the others object. And I said, but this is my proof.
This goes on every week for 3.5 months, neither one of them knowing what's going on in the sessions, except that there must be something good happening because Barney's ulcer's taken care of. He's able to get back to work. Finally, Dr. Simon figures they're ready. He brings them both in together instead of separately and plays back a composite tape of all these sessions. I've heard the tape. They were astonished to find that they had each independently relived the same incredible experience.
The beings that had been on the craft were now standing in the middle of the road, a dirt road, blocking our way. The car motor stalled. They separated, came up on each side, took us out of the car, and at that point, I realized that they undoubtedly planned to take us on board.
Of that craft having landed, of them being taken on board against their will, treated as specimens. Stick a needle here, scrape a little skin there.
I was taken into the first room, Barney into the second room, where we were given, as the leader, as I call him, gave us testing.
No religious messages, no trip anywhere.
Our examinations are very much similar in that with both Barney and I, they checked our eyes, ears, nose, throat, took samples of our hair, fingernail, and they scraped our skin.
They were put back out, told they wouldn't remember, and didn't until this elaborate, sophisticated, expensive procedure was conducted. Now, let's face it, that's a pretty far-out story. Well, I read the book, The Interrupted Journey. I read the 2 Look magazine articles. I talked to John Fuller, talked to Dr. Simon. It was in my gray basket, not black, not white, maybe. Everybody needs a gray basket about UFOs. And then I had the lucky opportunity in November 1968 to spend 4 hours with Betty and Barney, just the 3 of us, in Pittsburgh, where I was living. I was very impressed with them. Obviously sensible, sensitive, intelligent people. Make a long story short, I buy the story. And you say, big deal, you believe them, where's the evidence? There's a lot of different kinds of evidence. I only want to focus on one part of it as appropriate for being here at the Space Center. Betty, under hypnosis, is reliving how she's trying to get the leader of this 11-being crew to tell her where he's from, and the understatement of the decade.
I said, I know you're not from this planet.
Now, Barney was in another room. They were being examined separately. So finally, to get her off his back, this leader shows her what I can only describe as a 3-dimensional star map. It was like an aquarium with points of light, which were supposedly stars, 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. 3 different kinds of lines connecting these stars for trade expeditions and occasional expeditions and regular heavy trade. 2 big circles that were supposedly the base stars connected by lots of lines. And she's looking up at this thing, and she asks the leader, well, where are you on the map? Wise guy alien, he says, you know where you are on the map?
I told him no, that I knew nothing about astronomy.
How can I tell you where you're from, where I'm from, if you don't know where you're at?
I just didn't have the necessary knowledge.
Now, poor Dr. Simon, the psychiatrist, world-class expert on post-traumatic stress syndrome using hypnosis to unlock what happened. I mean, it's bad enough he's got 2 intelligent people here telling this crazy story about a saucer landing beings taking him on board, but now he's got a star map and trade routes, oh boy. He asks if Betty can remember what the map looked like. She says yes. He gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. If and only if she can remember it accurately, please draw it later on. She goes home and she draws, and you can see it here. This is what was published in the book. And it's kind of fascinating. Trade routes and occasional expeditions, but there is one little teeny tiny problem. What does it mean? We have no reference point. It's obviously not all the stars in the galaxy. It's not all the stars in the neighborhood. We'll never know, is what people thought. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't, but there's no way to find out. Well, a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish had read the book. She was curious. She didn't think aliens would look anything like us, and they seemed to be sort of humanoid. But she visited Betty and decided, well, there was one thing she could do. She could build a 3-dimensional model of our local galactic neighborhood and see if she could find a 3-dimensional pattern that matched the 2-dimensional one that Betty drew. Well, it turned out she's now built a total of 26 3-dimensional models. The point of doing this now is that the stars are where they are. They're not randomly distributed. If we build a model, we can look around it from all different directions. What's difficult about doing this is we have great angle data on the stars. We know where to aim a telescope to see a particular star. 2 angles tell us. But we don't have good distance data. Astronomers aren't going anywhere. It doesn't much matter how far or how close along this line of sight. But you can't build a model without the distance data. Now, Marjorie thought she'd get many fits to the map. She got none until she built a new model using the newest data, the Gliese catalog, Wilhelm Gliese, catalog of nearby stars, had the best data ever compiled on the distances. She rebuilt the model, and lo and behold, there was the pattern, angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was a special day for Marjorie, believe me. Now, here's one of her models that matches the star map. Now, there's several special things here you have to understand. First is a local neighborhood. The biggest model only went out 50 light years or so right next door. Second, all the stars connected with the lines are the right kind for planets and life, sun-like stars. And all the sun-like stars in this very well-defined three-dimensional volume of space are in the pattern. Now, the chance of that happening by accident, remembering that only 46 out of the 1,000 stars in a local neighborhood are like the sun, and yet every one of the pattern stars is a sun-like star, and every sun-like star in this volume of space is part of the pattern. The chance of that happening by accident, 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million, depending on whose statistics you believe. Several special things now. One, the pattern makes sense, nearest star, nearest star, nearest star. That's good, not back and forth. Two, strangely enough, it turns out that all the pattern stars are in a plane. It's like pepperoni on a pizza pan, thin pizza, all in a plane. Rather than raisins in a big fat loaf of raisin bread, which is what you'd expect that they'd be distributed all over the place. Nobody knew that before Marjorie's work. Most important, nobody doing what Marjorie did before Betty had the experience in '61 or the book came out in '65 could have come up with the same identification of the stars because the correct distance data wasn't available until 1969. Obvious question. Where did Betty, a social worker, knew nothing about astronomy, get the right information as to where the stars were in 1961, when nobody on this planet had that information at that time? The only possible explanation is that it came from somebody from off the Earth. We can see that the source of that information had to be somebody who'd been away from the solar system. None of us Earthlings have been, so far as we know. Even more intriguing, I suppose, is the fact that this work tells us where those particular aliens originated. Here's a map that shows the names of the stars in our very local neighborhood. Our star is the sun up in the top right-hand portion of the picture. Now, we're out in the boondocks here. The sun is 4.5 light years from the next star over. There's not many stars behind us for 15 or 20 light years. We're out in the boondocks. The base stars, however, are 37 light years or so away from us. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli, that's the Greek letter Zeta, and the constellation Reticulum. You can't see it from here. You've got to go down the equator or below. These two stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli, are only a few light weeks apart. They're 100 times closer to each other than our star, the sun, is to the next star over. 100 times. So from a planet around one, looking over at the other, you can see the other star all day long, and with a not very big telescope, you could directly observe planets around the other star. Now, it wouldn't be surprising if there were earlier interstellar between the stars travel, when your nearest neighbor is only a few light weeks away as it is for them, as opposed to our situation of several light years. Especially when I tell you one of the key features about this star, these two stars, is that they're about 1 billion years older than the sun. Billion with the B.
Just quickly, yes or no, do you believe in extraterrestrial life conceptually? In the probability or at least possibility?
There are 24 of us that left the Earth and came back.
Well, you know what
There are 12 of us that walked on the moon.
But how about things with, like green and...
Somebody originated someplace else.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Why not?
Well, okay, why not? That's a good enough answer. All right.
But we don't know.
No,
So again, would it be surprising to any rational person that beings with another sun-like star just around the corner would get started sooner on interstellar travel when they've got a billion-year opportunity for a head start? Very exciting piece of work.
I received a copy of the radar report from Pease Air Force Base, where they had tracked an unidentified craft at 2:14 a.m. Just about the time we estimate that the UFO left. We went back and we found the spot where we were captured. It was not a fantasy. It was a real experience. And I believe that I have enough evidence to establish that.
An obvious question, of course, is what do those guys look like? This is a drawing done by New Hampshire artist David Baker sitting next to Barney as Barney, under hypnosis, described what they look like. It's not an artist concept. It's a police artist drawing of a kidnapper, if you want to look at it that way. Here is a sculpture done from a bunch of drawings like the ones you just saw. Your typical little gray man, or typical Zeta Reticulum, whatever you want to call him. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head and a body, skull bigger in proportion to the body than ours, big eyes, practically no nose, mouth, ears. Typical alien. Not a cross between a giraffe and a zebra. The science fiction writers are much more imaginative than the abduction witnesses. Remember now, this is one of hundreds of cases that have been carefully investigated of abductions. It's happening. Whether we like it or not is beside the point.
The evidence suggests, beyond any doubt, as far as I'm concerned, that we're being visited by some form of intelligence which is higher than ours, and some kind of technology which is higher than ours, and it is able to pick up human beings at will as objects of study, the way we might a lesser species. To admit all of those things as possibility, as a real possibility, is to be staggered. So we keep it at arm's length conveniently.
The evidence is simply overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited. Now, you've got to ask the right question. I'm certainly not saying all UFOs are alien spacecraft, any more than all isotopes are fissionable.
So you'll accept that lots of UFOs are, in fact, imaginary and people sort of...
Most isotopes aren't fissionable either. Most people aren't 7 feet tall, but the basketball coach says, give me the guy who is. I don't care about the midgets of the world.
Okay.
Let's just set it up. You're a very successful builder, contractor in Gulf Breeze, making good money, and one night in November of '87, you see an object.
Right. I had no inclination as to what that day might bring. It was Veterans Day, 1987. I'd come home and was wrapping up my business for that day, sitting in my office, looked out the glass picture window over my desk in my office, and a light caught my eye through the pine burrows of some trees out in my circle driveway, and lo and behold, I couldn't figure, what is this thing? There's a glow there, what is this? And it was obscured by the trees. So I was curious enough, so I got up and went to my front porch. Got a little bit clearer look at it, and just the adrenaline starts flowing because you realize immediately you're not looking at something of our technology or technology that you think that we might possess.
Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, 2 Mississippi fishermen, reportedly abducted and examined by creatures aboard a UFO in Pascagoula in 1973. A doorway appeared and 3 creatures floated toward them.
They just seemed to glide outside, and one right behind the other, and there was 3 of them.
Area 51, that mysterious corner of the Nevada test site, is no longer much of a secret. We have communicated with several people who say they know of the saucer program. A technician in a highly sensitive position told us it is, quote, common knowledge among those with high security clearances that recovered alien discs are stored at the Nevada test site. A Las Vegas professional who once served in the military and was stationed at the test site says he saw a flying disc land outside the boundaries of Area 51.
The best paper by far, in my opinion, was one by the late Dr. James E. McDonald. Jim was a professor of physics at the University of Arizona, and initially a skeptic about flying saucers, as I was too, until I looked at the evidence. Jim personally interviewed over 500 witnesses. And these were almost all pre-screened cases, so he spent his time on the unknowns rather than knowns, which is the way to do it if you can manage. To make a long story short, he concluded that this is the most challenging scientific problem of our time, that some UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin, and that the Air Force Project Blue Book effort, at least, was completely inadequate from a scientific viewpoint. But he went a step farther. He presented information on 41 separate cases, subdivided into 6 groups, each group dealing with the typical objection of the debunker. You've probably heard them all. How come they're never seen on radar? Gives you half a dozen good radar cases.
And an airman who worked at Nellis at a radar installation says he and his fellow servicemen watched over a period of 5 nights unusual objects flying over the Groom Mountains. He says the radar images indicate the object zoomed into range at speeds of 7,000 miles per hour and then would stop on a dime, and that nothing we have is capable of doing that.
Why aren't they ever seen over big cities? Gives you a bunch of big city cases. He gives you many multiple witness cases. 10 witnesses, 20 witnesses, 50 witnesses. Well, how come they're never seen by the professionals who watch the sky? The meteorologists, the astronomers, the pilots. He gives you a bunch of sightings by each of those groups as well. So you can raise any of those objections you wish, but please don't reach a conclusion until you've studied the evidence.
But just briefly, you do believe there's been a cover-up, don't you, in the States?
Oh, there's no question that there's a cosmic Watergate. It's easy to establish. We've gone to court using the Freedom of Information Act. Here's what you get after, well, this is a justification to a federal court judge by the National Security Agency, a huge organization, for withholding 156 UFO documents. They wouldn't even show any to the judge. This is their affidavit to him, and that's not the only page like that, you can see.
All blacked out.
75% blacked out. Here's what I got from the CIA under Freedom of Information about UFOs. 5 years to get that very exciting document.
Right. Look, Stanton, we're going to have
another
to leave
one,
it.
equally exciting.
Oh, yeah, I've read that one, but not the other one. We're going to leave it.
On January the 13th, a Friday appropriately, on an English talk show, Nick and Ann, a British rock musician named Reg Presley, no relation to Elvis, startled the world by saying that he was aware of 15 reels of 10 minutes each of 16mm footage shot of autopsies and wreckage relating to crash flying saucers in New Mexico. Incredible news. He hadn't seen much of it, and it belonged to a man named Ray Santilli.
Last year that some tantalizing pictures were released. Black and white grainy footage showing an alien autopsy. The debate about whether they're genuine or not is still raging. The footage was first seen in this country last August in a Channel 4 documentary called The Roswell Incident. It told the story of a UFO that crash-landed in New Mexico in 1947. This was one of the most important events in UFO history. The program used several minutes of footage which apparently showed an autopsy carried out on aliens recovered from the crash site. The footage was brought to light by a video producer called Ray Santilli.
We're talking about roughly 16 minutes of footage of an autopsy of a supposed alien recovered from a crash flying saucer in 1947. Surely one of the most important discoveries ever made by mankind. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary investigation.
But the organizers of a UFO conference in Leeds next week say they have new evidence which will prove the footage to be a hoax. They're flying in the top Roswell investigator, Stanton Friedman. He believes aliens did land at Roswell, but he doesn't believe the autopsy film.
I was here in April of '95. I met with Mr. Santilli. I did not get a chance to see the footage. He wouldn't show it to me. He didn't want me to see the footage. He didn't want anybody who was going to be critical. He was looking for people who would go along for the ride, I think, who would say, yea, verily, this is the greatest thing since peanut butter. Now, on about July 2nd, there was apparently a mid-air collision between two flying saucers in New Mexico. One of them came down almost intact in the plains of San Agustin, a very remote area west of Socorro, New Mexico. The other part, apparently, part of it exploded, showering debris on the Foster Ranch, southeast of Corona, New Mexico, northwest of Roswell. And a couple miles away, apparently, bodies were found. There was some lightweight, very strong, seemingly structural material that you couldn't break through with a sledgehammer. Very thin. And there were some I-beam-like pieces, perhaps 3/8 inch high. Had the weight of balsa wood, nothing to these things. But you couldn't cut them, break them, burn them, and there were strange pastel symbols along the inside of the eye. But as the first to talk to many of the key witnesses, without television cameras, without any public sort of side to this thing, I'm absolutely convinced that bodies were recovered at both locations. We have descriptions of those bodies from people who saw them. We have descriptions of wreckage. And that's a very important database. It's also important to realize that there was very strong intimidation of many of the people who were involved in this case. One of the people who was never said anything about this, wasn't spoken to until I spoke to him in 1989, was Glenn Dennis. He was a mortician at the local funeral home, the Ballard Funeral Home. And when he finally told his story, he had talked to a nurse at the base who had been involved in what was apparently an autopsy, cutting up little bodies that smelled to high heaven.
She said, you won't believe what happened. And she said, before I talk to you, before I tell you anything, excuse me, I'm having a throat problem here, but she said, you have to give me a sacred oath that you will not ever mention my name or not. She said, you can get me in a lot of trouble. So she said, what I'm going to tell you, you don't know where you got this, you know. And she said she never smelled anything so horrible in her life when she got in there. And I said it was the most gruesome, most horrible sight that she had ever seen in her life. The smell was almost devastating. She said, I was never so horrified in my life. She said, no, this is what it is. She said, this is something that no one's ever seen.
So there is no question from Glenn Dennis's testimony, the testimony of all these other people, people who saw the bodies out in the plains, that at least 2 saucers crashed, that wreckage was recovered, that the government grabbed all the goodies, intimidated the people, had bodies. And if there were bodies, there would have been autopsies. And if there were autopsies, there certainly would have been film footage shot.
Friedman was the original investigator at Roswell and has been researching the incident for over 20 years. He thought the autopsy film could be important, but when he finally saw it, he was unimpressed.
The main reasons I was disappointed when I saw the footage. One, the body didn't look like any alien I'd ever heard described. I have 2 separate testimonies as to what the bodies from the Roswell crashes look like. The question is the footage genuine? Or there are 2 other possibilities. People want to say it's either a fraud or it's real. It could be footage shot of a real autopsy of a genetically handicapped or several Earthlings, as opposed to just a Hollywood production. We have all 3 possibilities, and we don't know. So I have made a very massive effort, as have a number of other people, to try to sort this out. One problem is that every time I checked on Mr. Santilli, he wasn't telling the whole truth. As time has gone on, we've looked more carefully at the footage itself. For example, there's one scene where the right hand seemingly is completely separated from the arm. There's a little wedge of space there. This is with 6 digits now.
And then later, it seems to be attached, as if somebody took a hand and put it on an arm. But one of the witnesses that talked to Glenn Dennis, a nurse at the base hospital, told him.
She said, last night I made a diagram. She said, you won't believe this, but she said, I made a diagram, and she said, these little bodies. And she gave me she drew me a diagram of an arm, because she said the anatomy from the shoulder to here was real short, and this arm was longer here.
Which is the reverse of our situation. She said 4 digits. That doesn't match. Practically no ears, nose, mouth, just a little slit, some holes, and yet there are very clear ear folds, whatever you want to call them, and something of a mouth, and certainly a nose.
The eyes were very deeply set back and set in. And she said the amazing thing about the skulls that it wasn't like ours, that it was kind of like a newborn baby. They were kind of flexible, that, you know, the doctors could move, that it wasn't, you know, like a hard skull.
None of this stuff matches. Now, I cannot say that we have proven that this is a hoax shot by this company at this location on this date. And Mr. Santilli told me not only that they had boxes of material about the cameraman, which proved that he was who he says he was and where he says he was at the time. None of that's been put forth. But he also said that Kodak had dated the film. Well, as it turns out, they hadn't. He'd given them a piece of leader with no image on it. Well, Kodak's requirements were about 50 frames, 2 seconds worth roughly, of film full width, because shrinkage is important from determining dates, and with image that's in the autopsy footage. He promised to provide it, promised to provide it, promised to provide it. The wreckage in the film. Now, if you look carefully, the so-called I-beams, that they call them that, have strange symbols which spell video if you look at it in the right angle, which sort of old Greek letters. Doesn't look anything at all like the replica that's been created by Dr. Jesse Marcel, working with an engineer. He handled pieces of the wreckage. And he's talking about I-beams like this size rather than this size. We've just got lots of questions and no answers. And some of those questions should have answers if we are to proceed on the basis that this stuff is legitimate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary investigation. This footage has not had it.
Well, I don't know why you're skeptical about everything.
Well,
people ask me, how can you talk about flying saucers if you haven't seen one? And I tell them I've been talking about neutrons and gamma rays for 38 years. I've never seen one of those either.
Yeah. Well,
they're real. I've never seen Sydney, Australia.
Yeah.
It's
just
there.
Briefly, you do.
UFOs. Is there a government conspiracy to keep the truth from America?
That story set the tone for almost 47 years of massive misrepresentation and cover-up. We're dealing with a cosmic Watergate that continues to this day. And one of the many myths about this subject is that the Freedom of Information Act gives you access to anything you want. There can't possibly be a cover-up that would extend that long. A group of us called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy went after the CIA. We want your UFO stuff. They said, we don't have any, go away. We appealed, they denied, we go to court. Judge says, do a search. They come back to court, they'd found 239 UFO documents. In the early 1990s, there was a great deal of discussion about Roswell. New books came out, more witnesses came forward. And as a result of this, many people in New Mexico wrote Congressman Stephen Schiff. He's based in Albuquerque, seeking the truth about Roswell. And he wrote requests for information from the Secretary of Defense, got no answer. Wrote again, got no answer. Finally, a third time, his request was referred to the Air Force Liaison Office, and they just kind of casually brushed him off by saying, check, we've referred your request to the National Archives. So he's getting a runaround. Congressmen aren't accustomed. They ask for a briefing. Normally they get it. So because he sits on the Government Operations Committee of Congress, he was talking to the General Accounting Office, Congress's investigative arm. And they were talking about other matters. Is there anything else that we can do for you? And he mentioned, well, he'd sure like to stop this runaround that he was getting from the Air Force. Well, let us look into it. The GAO, its mandate. Look around all the possible government agencies, find out where their records are located, and see what you can find out about Roswell. So as a massive effort, they sought information from the Air Force, from the CIA, from all kinds of other agencies. And you have to locate records, not always easy. The Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, decided to take the GAO initial challenge. They did go to the Air Force and said, we need to look at all your records relating to what might have happened there. In 94, September 8th, 1994, long before the GAO report was out, it was still working on the report. The Air Force put out its own report, a preemptive strike. What a strange report. And it was only 25 pages long or so, by Colonel Richard Weaver, who actually has taught courses in disinformation, which seems very appropriate here. Now, in effect, what they say in this report then was that, well, we did lie back in 1947. It wasn't the radar reflector from a weather balloon. What it really was part of a mogul balloon, super secret, highly classified project. As if this was supposed to be some kind of a revelation. Well, those of us who've been involved, I've been working on this since 1978, know very well about Project Mogul. The Air Force, of course, didn't talk to all of the witnesses. They made it sound like they did. They didn't talk to Major Marcel's son. He's still alive. Medical doctor, pilot, flight surgeon. He handled pieces of the record. They didn't talk to the rancher's son. He was out there on site, found pieces of the wreckage. He handled them. Didn't talk to him. Didn't mention that they didn't talk to him. Didn't talk to the neighbor to whom the rancher had shown pieces before he even talked to the military. I mean, the Air Force has a long history of massive misrepresentation about flying saucers, dating right back to this incident, but many times afterward, and saying false and misleading statements.
There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to hide at all. There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to hide at all.
The Air Force also, they referred in this 25-page report to all these attachments about Project Mogul, as if this was some big deal somehow. In several of the attachments, I managed to get hold of copies. They weren't distributing them. I know a television crew that was at the Pentagon wanted to get access to the attachments. They wouldn't let them into the library to do that.
There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to hide at all.
The Air Force said they had the CIA look at the pictures as if they had suddenly discovered these pictures. I found them in 1979 in Texas. Pictures of General Ramey with wreckage in his office. Him and Colonel Dubose with wreckage in his office. It's phony wreckage. And so we're dealing here with massive misrepresentation. Now, later, it is interesting, the GAO finally put out its report. It was kind of a disappointment. Congressman Schiff got it July 29th, 1995, put it out that very same day. They listed a number of government agencies from whom they had sought material. They hadn't found anything, basically. That's important for one reason, anyway. They acknowledged, and Congressman Schiff, to his credit, pointed it out, that one of the things that was missing were the outgoing messages from the Roswell Army Airfield for a 2-year period, including the time of the crash. And nobody knows why that material was destroyed or what was in it. Buried in this GAO report, unfortunately, is clear that they asked the government agencies, CIA, FBI, and so forth, to look in their Freedom of Information files. If there'd been anything solid in those, we'd have known that a long time ago.
Did the Freedom of Information Act provide the information windfall researcher Stanton Friedman was looking for? Hardly.
You can read 8 words on this CIA UFO document, and they're not very useful words. Doc reference, info location, stuff like that. Now, these guys have a weird sense of humor. I mean, here's a page, deny in toto, it says. They couldn't even find 8 lousy words to release. One of the things they did, now the Air Force was truly sneaky. They quoted this newspaper article. The next line, which they didn't quote, this is attributed to the rancher, was that I'm absolutely sure it was not a weather balloon. They leave that out very conveniently. We've had our 2 years of waiting. The question hasn't been solved, certainly not by the Air Force. The GAO report was inadequate and incomplete. And the American people and the American Congress are still being lied to.
Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, 2 Mississippi fishermen, reportedly abducted and examined by creatures aboard a UFO in Pascagoula in 1973. Do you think the United States government is keeping something from us about UFOs?
There's no doubt in my mind that they are.
In December 1984, I was first informed that two colleagues of mine in California, Jamie Chandray and William Moore, had received in the mail a roll of film on which there were 2 sets of 8 negatives each of a highly classified document which said that there was a crashed flying saucer recovered near Roswell, New Mexico in July 1947. It was a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower dated 18 November 1952. 8 pages is all we had. There's a list of a whole bunch of attachments which weren't there. And the 8th page was a supposed memorandum from President Truman dated September 1947 establishing a group called Operation Majestic 12. And the briefing for Eisenhower clearly states it's an intelligence and research and development highly classified activity. It names the members of the Majestic 12 group, which included the first 3 directors of Central Intelligence, several outstanding scientists. It was an all-star cast. The question, of course, is were these documents genuine? I spent well over a decade on these documents. Now, all the original members of MJ-12 were dead, the last one dying just 3 months before we got the documents, which is very significant no matter how you look at it. Document classification is confidential, secret, top secret, and then top secret something, ultra, umbra, magic, whatever. That's a compartmental designation. You can only have access to that information if you've been cleared for that compartment. I've been to 15 archives at one time or another, spending weeks at some of them, the Eisenhower Library, Truman Library, National Archives, Library of Congress Manuscript Division, etc. I have never yet seen special compartmented information. It's extraordinarily rare. Another document received much more recently is a standard operating manual. What do you do if you recover the wreckage and bodies from crashed flying saucers? Also top secret magic. That's almost too good to be true. It was on a roll of film, more than 25 pages. Wow. Several of us, all of whom have worked on highly classified programs, all of whom have technical backgrounds, 4 of us altogether, have been digging into these very deeply. It is our consensus that we can't find any reason for rejecting these documents. We've all raised questions, but the documents pass the test. So I don't think there's any question that there really was a Majestic 12 group. What's interesting about the operating manual is it makes it sound routine, the recovery of wreckage. Remember, the government has the radar. They can spot something coming in. And it gives standard procedures for lying to the public and for how you box up this stuff, wrap it and ship it, and where different kinds of things go to, including bodies. And it stresses that national security here is what's the all-powerful element in determining what we do. If we got to lie to the public, if we have to give cover stories, an important part of this is to keep the Russians from knowing what we're doing. So these documents are probably the most important ones ever leaked to the American public. I worked under security for 14 years. I can appreciate the need for security about certain things sometimes. But I think it's time that the American people and the rest of the world got told that planet Earth is being visited by extraterrestrial spaceships, that we've known about it since 1947. We have bodies, we have wreckage, we've learned a lot of technology. I think the public can handle it. Don't you?
Area 51, that mysterious corner of the Nevada test site, is no longer much of a secret. The fact that secretive things go on here is a given, even to the Soviets, who make daily spy flights over the facility to take a peek at what's going on. Area 51 is where Francis Gary Powers and the other U-2 pilots were trained in the 50s, and where the U-2 itself was developed. The SR-71 spy planes that spotted Soviet missiles in Cuba in the early 60s were also developed at 51. 51 is where stealth technology was nurtured, where Star Wars devices are still tested, and where all manner of CIA monkey business has been plotted and refined.
And I feel that there's absolutely no sign of a hoax, that the photographs are genuine, that the witnesses are telling the truth, and that this presents probably the best, without any doubt, the best photographic evidence in 40 years of UFO investigations.
Do you sort of extend your beliefs in things that most people don't believe in?
I look for evidence. No, I look for evidence. But remember, most people do believe in flying saucers, so that doesn't, I don't fit into the box of things most people don't believe in. But the problem is, you can't dismiss eyewitness testimony too readily. The reason we can explain most UFO sightings as relatively conventional phenomena, Venus or whatever, is because people are good observers, they're lousy interpreters. We know it was Venus because they saw it in that direction at that time, at that angle above the horizon. You can't say they're lousy only if they describe something that doesn't fit. And in courts of law, after all, eyewitness testimony is extremely important.
I have no reason to believe that this film is that of an autopsy of an alien recovered anywhere, no less New Mexico, in 1947. The body, the wreckage, the story, there is no validation whatsoever.
Anyway, I drove her. We looked in the Ocean Club, and I drove her back to the barracks there, to the nurses' quarters. And that was the last time I ever saw her. Sorry, yeah.
This is the most fantastic story I've ever heard. And every word of it's true, too. That's the fantastic part of it.